Sister banned me from her wedding over her fiancé. He found out and dumped her. Now my entire family is begging me to save the day. Hey everyone, I'm Tessa, 24, and I could really use some outside opinions on this mess. So, my older sister Camille, who's 29, was supposed to be getting married to her longtime fiancé, Marshall, also 29. They had been together for years, and as far as everyone knew, things were going great. We all thought they were a perfect match. But out of nowhere, things took a strange and completely unexpected turn, and now their wedding is off. The reason? Marshall refuses to marry Camille because he thinks she's being unfair by not allowing me to attend their wedding. And to make things even crazier, Camille has convinced herself that Marshall is in love with me. Yeah, I know how insane that sounds, but let me explain. A little background. I've never been particularly close to my sister or my parents. There wasn't a huge falling out or any major drama, it's just that once I left for college, I naturally started drifting away. Honestly, I've barely spent any real time at home since I moved out. Most spring breaks, instead of going back to my parents' house, I'd either travel or stay with my grandparents. It always seemed like the better option, rather than dealing with the uncomfortable and forced interactions that came with being at home. The truth is, my parents and sister have always been on the same page about everything, and I've always felt like an outsider in my own family. We just don't see the world the same way, and no matter how hard I tried growing up, I never truly fit in. They had their own little bubble that I was never really a part of. I can still remember all the times they'd bond over things I had zero interest in. And when I tried to bring up something I cared about, it was like I was speaking a completely different language. They'd listen for a second, nod politely, then steer the conversation right back to whatever they found interesting. After a while, I stopped trying. What hurt the most, though, was that when I started pulling away, they didn't seem to care. They never reached out, never asked why I was distancing myself. It was as if my absence didn't even register. You'd think family would notice when one of their own starts slipping away, but mine never did. And that just confirmed what I had felt all along. I never really belonged with them. Eventually, I stopped making the effort. I only went home for the big stuff, holidays, birthdays, the occasional family event. But even then, it didn't feel like I was coming home, it felt like I was just a visitor. The conversations were always shallow and polite, but never meaningful. And my relationship with Camille? That was even more distant. Camille has always been the golden child, the one who did everything right, followed the exact path my parents wanted, and fit seamlessly into their world. Meanwhile, I was the odd one out. The black sheep. It wasn't like my family was outright cruel, but they had this way of making me feel small. You know those comments that seem harmless on the surface but sting deep? Yeah, that was their specialty. Over time, I realized it was easier to just stay away than to constantly feel like I was in the wrong place. Where things took a turn. Last Christmas, Marshall came with Camille to our family's holiday dinner. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel completely invisible. My family has this way of making me feel like I don't belong, like I'm an outsider in my own home. But Marshall? He didn't treat me like that. He was kind, actually talked to me, and made me feel like a normal human being instead of the weird misfit my family seems to think I am. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I mean, it was just basic decency, right? But apparently, Camille saw things differently. It's not like Marshall and I had some deep, personal heart-to-heart. We just made small talk stuff about school, travel, funny things that happened at work. Normal, casual conversation. But Camille? She was watching me like a hawk the entire night. I kept catching these cold, cutting looks from her across the table, but I honestly didn't think much of it at the time. That was, until later that evening when she pulled me aside. I'll never forget what she said. I know what you're doing. You've always been jealous of me, and now you're trying to steal my fiancé. I was completely floored. Steal her fiancé? What? Where was this even coming from? I actually laughed because I thought she had to be joking. But she wasn't. She kept going on about how Marshall was acting different around me, how I was being too friendly with him. I was so stunned I didn't even know how to respond. Camille has always needed to be the center of attention. She's the one my parents adore, the one who always does everything right, and I get that. But accusing me of trying to steal her fiancé? That was a new level of crazy, even for her. I tried to brush it off, like I do with most of her dramatics, and figured she was just feeling insecure about something. We were never close anyway, so I assumed she'd get over it. But she didn't. The fallout. After that night, things only got weirder. Camille, who was already distant, became downright cold. She barely spoke to me, and when she did, her words were clipped and dry. At family gatherings, she latched onto Marshall like glue, practically staking her claim on him. The whole thing was ridiculous. Marshall, though? He didn't change at all. He was still polite, still friendly, still normal around me, which made the whole situation even more bizarre. But what really got to me was how quickly my family seemed to take Camille's side. No one said anything outright, but the shift was obvious. My mom started giving me these strange, wary glances whenever Camille and Marshall were in the same room as me. My dad, who usually stays out of stuff like this, suddenly started making these pointed little comments about how family should always support each other and how relationships need to be respected. It was all very passive-aggressive, but the message was clear: they had already decided I was guilty of something. And that's what really made me angry. I have never been the kind of person to involve myself in anyone's drama, especially not my sister's relationship. I barely even talked to Camille outside of family gatherings. So how, exactly, did I become the villain in all of this? Why in the world would I be interested in my sister's fiancé? That's the part that never made sense to me. And yet, a few months after that ridiculous Christmas confrontation, I found out, through my grandparents, of all people, that Camille was engaged. Yep. My own sister was getting married, and she didn't even bother to tell me. Now, I wasn't expecting a heartfelt invitation with glitter and a handwritten note or anything, but finding out secondhand? That hit different. It was like a punch in the gut, the kind that doesn't necessarily shock you, but just confirms what you already knew. My family didn't think I was important enough to include. I guess, deep down, I had still been holding on to the tiniest hope that despite everything, despite the tension, despite the distance, she'd at least acknowledge me. Because we're sisters, right? Even if we're not close, even if we barely talk, I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd still be part of something so major in her life. But no. That was clearly too much to ask. At first, I didn't say anything. Maybe she was just busy. Maybe she figured my grandparents would tell me. Maybe it had just slipped her mind. I wanted to believe that. I know it sounds naive, but for some reason, I kept giving her the benefit of the doubt. I figured she'd reach out eventually. Or that, at the very least, an invitation would show up in the mail last minute. But days passed. Then weeks. Nothing. Just silence. And then out of nowhere, my phone rang. I blinked at the screen, almost in disbelief. Camille. We hadn't spoken since that night at Christmas when she accused me of trying to steal Marshall, so to say I was caught off guard would be an understatement. Still, I answered, keeping my voice casual, like I hadn't been completely forgotten by my own sister. After a few painfully awkward minutes of small talk, she finally got to the point. I'm not inviting you to the wedding. I sat there for a second, just processing. It wasn't like I had been counting down the days or anything, but hearing her say it outright still hurt. So I asked, why? And that's when she hit me with something so ridiculous, so completely absurd, I actually laughed. Since Marshall has feelings for you, I don't want you there. It would just be too awkward. I had to make sure I heard her right. Marshall, her fiancé, had feelings for me? I literally laughed out loud. Because what? First of all, no, he doesn't. And even if he did she really think I was going to show up, stand in the middle of the aisle, and dramatically confess my love for him like this was some bad soap opera? The whole thing was so ridiculous I didn't even have the energy to argue. I just said, have a great wedding and a happy marriage, and hung up. I wasn't about to beg to be included in something I was so clearly unwelcome at. Camille and I lived in completely different worlds, and I had made peace with that a long time ago. Yesterday should have been just another normal day for me. I wasn't invited to the wedding. I wasn't involved in any of the planning. I had moved on. Then, out of nowhere, my phone rang. It was my dad. The second I answered, he didn't even say hello. Just launched straight into, Tessa, you need to come to the venue right now. No explanation. No details. Just a demand. Naturally, I asked what was going on. And naturally, he refused to tell me. He just kept repeating that I needed to come immediately. Now, let's take a step back for a second. This is the same family that had excluded me from the wedding. The same people who had spent months treating me like an outsider. The same people who had made me feel like the villain in Camille's twisted little fairy tale. And suddenly, I was important? Yeah. No. So I told him straight up, I'm not going anywhere just because you tell me to, and hung up. Not even 5 minutes later, my phone started buzzing again. Camille. I sighed, already dreading whatever fresh nonsense she was about to throw at me. And sure enough, she hit me with something I never saw coming. Marshall, the guy she was supposed to marry, had straight up refused to go through with the wedding. He had called the whole thing off. Apparently, he couldn't stand how cruel Camille and my parents were. I mean, wow. The guy actually had the guts to see through all their BS and walk away. I won't lie, I was a little impressed. But Camille wasn't calling to apologize. Oh, no. She had a completely different reason for reaching out. She wanted me, the sister she had cut out, the sister she had accused, the sister she had treated like garbage, to show up at the rehearsal dinner. And the kicker? She wanted me to lie. She wanted me to tell everyone that the reason I wasn't at the wedding was because I didn't want to be there, not because she had banned me. Basically, she wanted me to swoop in, play the supportive sister, and clean up her mess while her entire relationship went up in flames. I almost laughed in her face. After everything she had put me through, accusing me of trying to steal her fiancé, cutting me out of the wedding, treating me like I was nothing, she actually thought I was going to save her? The audacity. So I told her, plain and simple. You're out of your mind if you think I'm going to do that. I could practically hear her jaw hit the floor through the phone. She started arguing, but I didn't stick around to listen. I hung up, put my phone on silent, and slept like a baby. Because, let's be real, Marshall calling off the wedding? That was karma in its purest form. I don't know what finally pushed him over the edge, but I have a pretty good idea. My parents and Camille have always been controlling, manipulative, and entirely self-absorbed. They've never stopped to consider how their actions affect others. I guess Marshall finally got tired of it. Do I feel bad for the guy? Almost. The aftermath. This morning was insane. I woke up to 117 missed calls. And over 200 messages. Yeah. You read that right. My phone was blowing up from the second I opened my eyes. And let me tell you, there is no worse way to wake up than to your entire family in full-on meltdown mode. Most of the calls were from Camille and my parents, obviously. But was I about to dive headfirst into that mess first thing in the morning? Absolutely not. I ignored it all and decided to start my day like a normal person. Because honestly, who deals with family drama before coffee? But as I went about my morning, a little part of me started to feel, well, a little guilty. At this point, I couldn't deal with my parents. I couldn't deal with Camille. I couldn't deal with the chaos that had erupted overnight. So I called the only people in my family I actually trust, my grandparents. They've always been my safe space. The only ones who don't twist my words, guilt-trip me, or make me feel like an outsider in my own family. And I knew if anyone could give me the truth without all the extra drama, it was them. The second my grandma picked up, I could hear the tension in her voice. She sighed and said, "Oh, honey, things are a mess." Apparently, Camille had been crying non-stop since last night. Marshall was completely shutting her out. He wasn't answering her calls, wasn't responding to texts, just gone. Mia. And my parents? Full-scale meltdown mode. They were scrambling, desperately trying to fix things. Calling everyone they could think of. Begging Marshall to reconsider. And then my grandma, in her usual gentle way, suggested something that almost made me laugh out loud. Maybe you should reach out to Marshall, just to clear up any misunderstandings. Misunderstandings? What misunderstandings? Marshall made his choice. And let's be real, it had nothing to do with me. But at the same time, I understood why my grandparents asked. They just wanted peace. They wanted the family to stop imploding over this disaster. And honestly, I was exhausted from the constant harassment. If talking to Marshall would finally make them leave me alone, maybe, just maybe, it was worth considering. Update 1. I thought if I ignored the calls, if I just waited it out, the drama would die down on its own. Spoiler alert, it did not. Because less than an hour after that conversation with my grandma, my doorbell rang. And when I checked, my entire family was standing outside. Camille. My parents. Marshall. They showed up unannounced like this was some kind of intervention or something. And I was not having it. They told me they wanted to come inside and talk. Like we were all about to have a heartfelt family meeting where I'd suddenly see the light and help them put everything back together. But after everything? After months of being blamed, excluded, treated like some villain in Camille's personal soap opera? Absolutely not. So I stepped outside, shut the door behind me, and told them, whatever you have to say, you can say it right here. And just like that, Camille jumped into her usual routine, demanding that I fix this. Like it was my responsibility to magically make Marshall change his mind. Like I was the one who needed to explain things to him. Like I somehow had the power to undo her mistakes. I just stood there, staring at her, trying to process the sheer delusion of it all. And then it hit me. No, I'm not doing this. I'm not going to lie for her. I'm not going to cover up what she did. So I turned to Marshall. And I told him everything. I told him how Camille had accused me of trying to steal him. How she had banned me from the wedding because she had convinced herself that he had feelings for me. How this kind of manipulative behavior wasn't new, it's been the pattern in my family for as long as I could remember. And as I spoke, I watched him. I saw the way his expression shifted. How he just stood there, processing it all, the wheels turning in his head. And then? Camille snapped. She slapped me. Full on. Open-handed. Across the face. The impact stunned me. But my first instinct? Slap her right back. Because are you kidding me? After everything, now she wanted to physically lash out? But before I could react, Marshall stepped in. He grabbed Camille's arm and pulled her away from me. They started talking in hushed tones, just out of earshot. I couldn't make out what was being said, but I could feel it. This wasn't just another fight. This was bigger. And then, a few minutes later, Camille turned back toward us. Tears were streaming down her face. She looked at me, looked at my parents, then at Marshall. And in a shaking voice, she said, "It's over." Marshall had ended the engagement. For good. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Just like that. Gone. And Camille? She collapsed into sobs. And for the first time in my life, I almost felt bad for her. Because as much as she's hurt me, as much as she's been manipulative, toxic, and downright cruel, no one deserves to have their entire relationship crumble like that. It was brutal. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the truth. She did this to herself. She pushed Marshall to his breaking point. Just like she had pushed me so many times before. And now, she had to live with the consequences. We all just stood there for a moment, Camille sobbing, Marshall gone, and my parents glaring at me like I was somehow the villain in all of this. Like it was my fault the engagement was over. Like Camille hadn't been the one controlling, blaming, and twisting the truth all along. And I was done. I mumbled something about needing to go inside, turned around, and walked back into my house. I shut the door behind me, sat down, and tried to process what the hell had just happened. It felt like something out of a TV drama, except this wasn't a show. This was my life. Since then? Radio silence. My parents haven't called. Camille hasn't texted. And honestly? I have no idea what happens next. Update 2. A lot of you have asked why I'd been so distant from my family for so long. I didn't go into it before because, honestly, it's a lot. But now, after everything that's happened, I think it's time I talk about it. Because maybe, just maybe, unpacking it will help me understand things better too. So here's the truth. I have social anxiety disorder. I've had it for as long as I can remember. But growing up, I didn't have the words for it. And my parents? They were old school. The kind of people who didn't believe in mental health. If I was visibly anxious, they'd say I was being dramatic. If I had a panic attack, they'd call me weak. If I struggled in social situations, I was just making excuses. So my entire childhood felt like I was being punished for something I couldn't control. And Camille? She was the golden child. Not just at home, but at school, too. Popular. Social. Always surrounded by people. And she knew it. And she made sure I knew it, too. I can't tell you exactly when I realized Camille wasn't just an annoying older sister, but a bully. It wasn't one big event, nothing dramatic. It was 1,000 little moments, small, biting comments, looks exchanged between her and her friends, the way my parents let it all slide. But one memory in particular stands out. I was about 15 when Camille invited some of her friends over for a sleepover. I was minding my own business, just walking into the kitchen to grab a snack, when suddenly, the room went dead silent. Then came the giggles. The knowing looks. And then Camille, in that sweetly condescending tone she'd mastered, smirked and said, "Oh look, it's our little hermit. She doesn't even know how to talk to people." They all laughed. I felt my face burn, my stomach twist into knots. I know to some people, that might seem small, like typical sibling teasing. But when it's constant? When your own sister leads the charge in humiliating you? When your parents do nothing to stop it? It hits different. And that's how it always was. Camille took every chance to mock my awkwardness, my struggles, my inability to fit in. And my parents? They either laughed along or dismissed it with, "Oh, she's just joking." But it wasn't a joke to me. It was humiliating. When things got worse. By high school, the anxiety I had struggled with for years only got worse. One day in particular stands out, a presentation day in English class. For someone with social anxiety, standing in front of a classroom full of people is the equivalent of a nightmare come to life. I had spent the whole night sleepless, sick with nerves. By morning, my stomach was in knots. My hands were shaking. I told my parents I didn't think I could do it, that I felt physically ill from the stress.
Their response? You need to suck it up and go. So I did.
I stood at the front of the class, my voice shaking, my face burning, as I stuttered my way through the presentation. I could hear the snickers, the whispers.
By the time I got home, I was in tears. And my parents? They just sighed and said, "It's just a presentation, Tessa. Stop making a big deal out of everything." That was their favorite line.
I was always making things a bigger deal than they were.
I was always being dramatic. By the time I left for college, I was mentally exhausted. I knew I needed help.
But I had spent my entire life being told that seeking help was weak, that anxiety was just some imaginary thing I needed to get over. It wasn't until I started seeing a counselor on campus that I finally understood.
She listened. Really listened. And for the first time in my life, someone actually told me, "What you're feeling is real." She recommended I see a psychiatrist for a proper diagnosis.
And when I finally got that diagnosis, social anxiety disorder, it was like a weight lifted off my chest.
Because suddenly, I had proof. I wasn't just being dramatic. I wasn't weak. I wasn't imagining things. What I was dealing with had a name.
And that changed everything.
Taking my life back, therapy taught me things I never thought I'd learn. How to handle panic attacks.
How to communicate my needs without guilt.
How to set boundaries with people who didn't respect me. And that's when I started pulling away from my family. Because I realized something.
Being around them triggered my anxiety.
So I stopped going home for every little thing. I stopped answering every call. I stopped responding to every text.
I started choosing myself. And for the first time, I felt like I had some control over my life.
But of course, my family didn't see it that way. To them, I was abandoning them. I was being selfish and ungrateful. They never once asked why I was pulling away. Never once checked if I was okay.
Instead, they accused me of being distant and dramatic, just like they always had.
And Camille?
Oh, Camille was Camille. Whenever I did come home for holidays, she made sure to throw in snide little comments. "Oh, look who decided to grace us with her presence. You must be way too good for your family now."
It was always the same. She never grew. Never changed. And everything that happened with Marshall? Only proved it even more. Update 3. It's been a month since my original post.
And if you think Camille moved on gracefully, you are sorely mistaken. Instead, she decided to channel all her anger toward me.
And let me tell you, it has been a roller coaster. First, she leaked my number to a bunch of people. Which meant my phone was suddenly flooded with messages from people I didn't even want to think about. Then,
she took it up a notch.
She started egging my house. Egging my house. Multiple times. Seriously, who does that? At first, I tried to ignore it.
I told myself, she'll get bored.
But after the second time I had to scrub dried egg off my front door and driveway, I was done.
I called my parents, thinking maybe, just maybe, they'd step in and talk some sense into her.
But you know what they said? "It's between you two girls." Are you kidding me?
This wasn't some petty sibling squabble anymore, this was vandalism. I expected them to at least pretend to care.
But nope. They would rather ignore the problem and pretend everything was fine.
So I handled it myself. I called Camille directly. And I told her, in no uncertain terms,
"If you ever do this again, I will file a police complaint. Because guess what? That's vandalism. And she could actually get in trouble for it." The second I said that,
she lost her mind. She launched into a full-on rant, calling me every name in the book, telling me I was being dramatic.
Dramatic. Of course. But I didn't let her get to me. I just hung up. And since then? Silence.
Maybe she's actually scared of the police. Or maybe she's just too busy plotting her next move.
Either way, I'll take the peace. Where I stand now.
I used to wish things were different.
That my family was different. That Camille would change. That my parents would see me. That
we could somehow fix what's been broken for so long.
But I don't wish for that anymore. Because I've learned something more important. I don't have to hold on to people who hurt me, even if they're family. Especially if they're family. So I'm done chasing their approval.
I'm done feeling guilty for choosing my peace over their dysfunction.
And honestly, that's the best decision I've ever made.